We're going to give everybody a few more minutes to sign on, so we'll be in our silent mode. If you can't hear us for any reason, be sure just kind of text us in the little box at the bottom, if you have a question. So if you can hang on just for a couple more minutes, and then we'll get started. Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Amelie Ramirez. I'm the director of Exito. Here we're based in San Antonio. We're part of the University of Texas Health Science Center, San Antonio, and the Cancer Center. I want to thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's session. Our session is going to deal with the responsible conduct of research, and we're really thankful for Dr. Michi willing to present this afternoon. But before I begin, I want to thank all of you who are tuned into our session this afternoon. This is really designed to help all of the individuals who've gone through either the Exito or the Minority Training Research Program based out of California at UCSF under the direction of Dr. Rena Pasick, and also the UCLA program. So we welcome you. If you know of others who are interested in participating in our webinars, that when you receive our notice, we hope that you will share the link with them so that they can join us. But before we begin, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. First, if you can all keep your phones muted, you can write a question in the box at any time. If you'll see the little field box at the bottom there. And the organizer, Areli, here in San Antonio, will announce the question after the presentation so that Dr. Michi can provide answers. So we will keep track of those questions. So please be as interactive as you'd like, and let us know what kind of questions come up during the presentation. At the end of the webinar, you'll receive a survey by email. We really need your feedback on this because we want to continue developing additional webinars. We feel that this is a convenient way to get information out to you, but we need your thoughts and suggestions and any other topics that you feel might be relevant. Please feel free to share that with us as well. So we look forward to hearing your suggestions and topics. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rena Pasick with the Minority Training Program in Cancer Control Research at UCSF. Dr. Pasick?
Thank you, Amelie. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning here in San Francisco. I also welcome you to this webinar and thank Dr. Michi for joining us and her willingness to conduct this. Dr. Michi is an assistant professor with the Institute for Health and Aging here at the University of California, San Francisco. She's a medical anthropologist and bioethicist, and she currently has NIH-funded research examining social and ethical issues in the translation of new genomic technology. and she's taught courses on bioethics and the responsible conduct of research, both at Stanford and here at UCSF. So she's the ideal person, I think, to be presenting on this very important topic. It is a requirement by the NIH that you participate as interns in our NIH-funded program. It's required that you participate in this, and when you hear what Dr. Michi has to say, you will, I'm sure, appreciate the importance of this presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Michi.
Hi, this is Marcia Mickey here at UCSF, and I am so excited to be talking to you today about social accountability and responsible conduct of research and research integrity. I think this is a great group for this particular topic because you're already trying to put social accountability into scientific research. So if you have thoughts about anything I'm saying during the talk, please type them in the chat window or email Aurelie or someone else that's an organizer that can transmit those to me. And particularly about the case study that you were sent ahead of time. I did get some responses by email, and that's great, and we'll talk about those. But you don't have to be identified online here. You can just transmit a thought to one of the organizers and let them read it for you, and that would be great. So I hope that you can see my screen just fine. If you can't, please let me know. But today's agenda is pretty simple. We're going to start by talking about why social accountability in research is important. And, oops, here we go. And we'll start with a little bit of history. And then we're going to talk a bit about the ethical foundations of research ethics and research integrity.
Dr. Nietzsche, can you go to full screen with your slides?
It is full screen, but it's not showing up full screen, huh?
We're seeing the slides on the side.
You're seeing this on the side. Oh, let me see if I can make that go away. And then, how about that? Is that better?
If you go to your PowerPoint and do full screen.
It's full screen right now, but if you can't see it, I will figure out how to make it look a little bit better. Let's see. Now, do you see the full screen now?
That'll work. We still see your slide deck on the left-hand side, but that's okay. Your slides are very readable. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I hope that you can still see it. I'm sorry about that. Not sure why it's not showing up full screen. Anyway, so social accountability in research is one topic. The history of that. And the pillars of research ethics, what inhibits ethically responsible research, what research misconduct actually is. There's a legal definition for research misconduct. Some warning signs for you if you're in doing team research, which many of you I'm sure will be doing. And then we'll sort of expand our picture a bit to talk about bigger issues in social responsibility. First of all, resource-poor contexts, which I'm sure many of you will be working in because I know that a lot of you are going to be dealing in health disparities. So that's an important particular context that has some special issues for research ethics. And then just the bigger picture in social responsibility in research and what that looks like. And then we're going to talk a bit about the case study. So let's start with thinking about research ethics and a bit of history on that. Now that photo that you just saw in the previous slide is of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And you may have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study. It's one of the best-known cases of research misconduct, and it began in 1932, but it didn't end until 1972. It was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health. This was not a bunch of rogue researchers. This was something that was sponsored by public money, and a perfectly respectable study when it began, and even up until its end. It was not thought of as necessarily problematic by those who were funding it. But what it did was it studied the effects of untreated syphilis in 400 African American men. And researchers withheld treatment even when penicillin became widely available as a proven treatment in the 1950s. And they didn't tell the subjects that they were in an experiment. Most of them thought that they were getting treatment for so-called bad blood. And some of the same scientists, it was later discovered in 2010, conducted U.S. government-sponsored unethical research experiments on human subjects in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948, and those involved intentionally infecting over 1,300 subjects with venereal diseases to test the effectiveness of penicillin. Only 700 of those subjects were given penicillin, and 83 of them died as a result of the study. And those subjects were also not informed that they were participating in an experiment. So that's pretty horrific. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Another big event that really shaped later research ethics and our understanding of that is the Nazi wartime medical experiments. They were morally abhorrent research experiments, quite cruel, many of them. You may have heard about these. They were conducted by German scientists on prisoners in concentration camps, also by Japanese scientists on Chinese prisoners of war. And those ended when the war ended. And they resulted in some trials after the war for war crimes, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But unfortunately, at the same time, there were some things going on in the U.S. The U.S. government was doing radiation experiments. They started in 1944 for reasons that you can imagine, because they were developing the bomb. But they didn't end until the 1980s. And they did experiments on human beings, looking at the effects of radiation. The subjects weren't told that they were participating in experiments, and they were conducted on cancer patients, pregnant women, and military personnel. So that led to the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code is extremely important for us as a sort of a foundation. You can see here.
Dr. Michi, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Your slides are not advancing.
Okay.
There you go.
Let's try it this way. I'm having to sort of do a funny thing with my slides to make it show up for you. How about that? Is that pretty visible for you? Right there?
Yeah, we can see them. It's just that we don't see when you're moving to the next slide.
Okay. Can you see the picture of the Nuremberg trial right now, the black and white photo?
Yes, yes, we can see that.
Okay, so I've changed my view so that maybe you can see it a little bit better when I advance to another slide. Hopefully that will work better.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so this is just a photo of what was happening in the Nuremberg trial. There was a code that was developed about human subjects research that was used in the Nuremberg trials. It was developed for the use in the Nuremberg trials in order to convict the Nazi scientists of war crimes. And so this is what it looks like. It's very focused on the Nazi war crimes and basically deals with three big issues. The first one, you can see, number one, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And this comes back in number 9, that the subject should be able to end the experiment at any time. And so that's one big issue that gets covered here. The second, there are really 3 big issues. The second big issue that gets covered here is in number 2, and that has to do with the value of the experiment. This should be research that's for the good of society and not just random playing around with human subjects in an instrumental kind of way. So That comes back in number 3 and number 6. And essentially what they're saying is there's no justification for any kind of risk or burden to human subjects and human beings if the scientific problem isn't important and valid. So the third big issue you see in number 4 and 5 and 7, 8, and 10. All of those are about avoiding harm to human subjects. And that was a very important issue, of course, because there was such cruelty done during the war. And all of these have to do with designing experiments ahead of time to avoid harm and then ending them also if harm seems likely. And this code really forms a basis for a lot of the human subjects regulations that come later. So I'm going to go down to the rest of our timeline here. After the war was over, we have another big event in sort of the history of some problems in research ethics. And that was the Willowbrook experiments. These began in 1956 and didn't end until 1980. And Willowbrook was a school, a boarding school for mentally disabled children, and in New York. And researchers there intentionally infected subjects with hepatitis and observed its natural progression, much as they did in the Tuskegee syphilis study. It was a similar kind of experiment except with hepatitis, and this time on children. And these experiments, in fact, were approved by the New York Department of Health. So, with all of that as a backdrop, in 1966, Henry Beecher then became a big whistleblower and really changed the course of how we thought about research ethics. He published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, the most prominent medical journal, and he described 22 unethical medical experiments, including Tuskegee and Willowbrook. And it really raised a lot of consciousness about this and led almost directly to a lot of outrage that led to, in 1974, an act called the U.S. National Research Act being passed. And this act authorizes federal agencies to develop human research regulations, including what we now call the Common Rule, which is what governs most of our human subjects research today. And it also established a national commission for the protection of human subjects. And that was a short-term commission. They were around for 5 years, and their final product was the Belmont Report. That was in 1979. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And then the final thing on our timeline is that in 1989, responsible conduct of research training requirements began. And the NIH required that all graduate students on training grants get education in responsible conduct of research. In 1999, that was expanded to all people conducting or overseeing human subjects research in some way. So that's really important stuff. So we're going to go back to the Belmont Report because that really sort of forms the basis for a lot of our human subjects regulation today, which is a big part of research ethics. As I said, it's the final product of that National Commission, and what it did was identify the basic ethical principles that should go under the conduct of human subjects research. And it formed the basis for what we now know as the Common Rule. So there's sort of 3 things going on in the Belmont Report. The first is that they drew a clear boundary between medical research and medical practice. And that may seem like it ought to be obvious, but it wasn't necessarily obvious at that time, because it's important now we realize that, that medical research is not done specifically for the benefit of an individual research participant, whereas medical practice is for the benefit of that individual patient. And we try to inform patients about that in human subjects research. But that boundary wasn't clearly drawn before the Belmont Report. They also laid out 3 principles and 3 applications of those principles. And those 3 principles are very important. The very first one is respect for persons. And mostly what that involves is informed consent in some way. There's also other things involved for people maybe who can't give informed consent, like, for example, the children in the Willowbrook trial. How would you deal with respect for persons in that case? And number 2 is beneficence, and underneath that, non-maleficence, doing good and not doing harm. And the biggest application of that is in assessing the risks and benefits of a particular study. And finally, the last principle is justice. And that's a big, big principle. So it's got a lot of things going into it. But one of the biggest ways that it gets applied to human subjects research is in the way that we select people to be in research. So if research is done primarily for the benefit of one population, it shouldn't be conducted mainly on another population. And that often happens, unfortunately, that research is conducted on less privileged populations or more marginalized populations, and they don't really see the benefits of that research. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more practically about what inhibits ethical research, because it's really understandable that there would be problems in research integrity, not just in human subjects research, but in lab research as well. And that's because of a lot of structural and human factors. One is simply conflicts of interest, that people have financial and other kinds of conflicts of interest, particularly if you maybe stand to profit from a discovery, or your lab or your institution stands to profit from it. Things like career competition and funding pressures are, of course, really important to individual researchers. All of us have to somehow make a career work for ourselves. We're competing with other people for jobs, for grants, for all kinds of things, and we're under a lot of pressure to show results and get publications. And so many of us feel overwhelmed. It's understandable. I often feel overwhelmed. And what it can make you do is be tempted to be cutting corners and not following protocols if they are going to take extra time or extra funds or extra energy. And then, of course, all of us believe in the research that we're doing, but sometimes that belief in a cause maybe makes you feel like there's a foregone conclusion and makes you disregard evidence and not really think of research in the most objective way. So those are all some things that are at work, and here's a couple of cases where they have been at work. One is a really important case in genetics, and that's that the death of Jesse Gelsinger. Now, Jesse was 18 years old, and he participated in a phase 1 gene transfer trial. That's a safety trial at the University of Pennsylvania. And this is for a condition called OTC deficiency that affects the liver. He had a fairly mild form of the disease, but he was volunteering to be in this trial because he really thought it would help other people, especially very sick babies. But unfortunately, he received the adenoviral vector that had the modified genes for this trial, and he died of a systemic immune response 98 hours later. Now, that can happen. Adverse events can happen in any trial, but there were investigations that revealed a lot of problems. One is that even though Gelsinger's liver was functioning at an inclusion level the day he signed up for the trial, the day he actually got the vector, that it was not functioning at those levels, and he should not have been given that dose. There had been adverse events in animals that were similar to what happened to him, and researchers had not reported those to the FDA, and they also hadn't reported to the FDA multiple protocol changes they had made in the experiment. And also, both the university and Dr. Wilson, the PI of the study, had significant financial conflicts of interest. Specifically, Dr. Wilson had a company, had spun off his discoveries into a company that was then funding this research through Penn. And so Penn stood to gain a lot from this, Dr. Wilson stood to gain a lot from this, and even though this case was settled, and it was a huge black mark for both the university and for the researcher who was barred from research for a fair amount of time, still they sold the company in 2000 after the settlement, and Dr. Wilson got a lot of money out of that sale, and so did Penn. So that's an example not only of how a problem in conflicts of interest and other issues can cause problems for an individual university or an institution or a researcher, but also this set back gene transfer research for many years. It became sort of a hands-off topic for a while because of this big black mark, and arguably set back this whole field for maybe a decade. Now, the second case I want to raise has to do with the Havasupai tribe, and you may have heard about this. The Havasupai tribe are a very small group of Native Americans that live in the Grand Canyon. At the time of this research in 1989, there were only about 600 Havasupai. And Arizona State researchers collected blood samples from them for a genetic study on diabetes, which was a big problem for the tribe, probably still is a problem for them. And so they were happy to contribute samples for that study. And even though the informed consent document said that those samples could be reused for other purposes, that fact was not really verbally communicated during the consent, and the tribe was completely unaware that these samples would be used for things that would be deeply, deeply offensive to them. Later on, when there was research done using these samples on schizophrenia, on migration, on inbreeding, the tribe didn't know about it until a member of the tribe just happened to be at ASU for a lecture and saw her samples and her family's and her tribe's samples being talked about in this context, and was absolutely shocked. And that led to a lawsuit in 2004. They sued both for violation of civil rights and for violation of medical confidentiality, along with some other claims. That case wasn't decided in court, so it doesn't create a legal precedent, but they did receive a fair amount of money to help the tribe with certain infrastructure, and ASU returned all the DNA samples. But this is another case where an individual act of not even necessarily misconduct, but a lack of integrity in the way you communicate with research subjects, then exacerbated existing mistrust, not just from the Havasupai, but from lots of different Native American groups about outside research, particularly genetics. And for example, the Navajo still have a moratorium on genetic research. You cannot conduct genetic research with the Navajo tribe. Their internal IRB, which has to approve all research, will not approve any genetic research until that moratorium is lifted. And it's been in place for quite a few years now. Okay, so let's talk about the actual legal definition of research misconduct, because it's actually quite narrow. But there are bigger issues in responsible conduct of research that are ethical and maybe are covered by other regulations. Research misconduct itself, though, is a very specific thing. It includes fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, and those must be intentional. And this is defined in federal law. It could mean in federal investigation and sanctions, but it doesn't exclude things like just making a mistake, being lazy or sloppy, or having some kind of difference in interpretation from your colleagues or from other people. But there are some possible consequences, and some of them are quite big. One is that institutions are required to conduct an inquiry and, if warranted, full investigation into the allegations. Federal agencies may do also the same thing. And if they find misconduct, researchers could have their grants stripped. They could be barred from getting future grants. They could face penalties from their own institution, including up to being fired. And you could also have civil and criminal liability, and that would mean fines or even jail time. But as I said, that doesn't include other ethical problems that aren't technically defined there. But those may be covered under other regulations, and certainly they're issues that ethically we should deal with. One is research without getting ethical approval from your institution's IRB or ethics board. That could get you into a lot of hot water. Another is lack of informed consent. Now, in some cases, that could be covered by regulations. In other cases, it could be in a legal gray area, like with the Havasupai. Financial mismanagement is obviously a big issue, but that's not covered as research misconduct. It's covered in other ways by regulations. And of course, conflicts of interest. Your institution has a conflicts of interest board that deals with those issues. Discrimination, of course, is covered by many different kinds of regulations that don't necessarily have to do with research, but they are a huge ethical problem in research. And poor mentoring is an ethical issue, I would argue, as well, and many people do. It's an issue that keeps people from knowing how to conduct their research in a way that has integrity. Now, I think all of us go into research with the best of intentions, but we're in team research, and sometimes you'll see misconduct even if you yourself are trying to be very ethical in the way you're conducting your research. So here's a few red flags, just so that you'll have them sort of under your belt. One of the biggest signs of research misconduct is when things are just too good to be true, and that can come up in a lot of ways. One is in a multi-site study, the progress at one site might be a lot greater than at other sites. A researcher's productivity might be phenomenal. I mean, not just that they're great, but so much more so than anyone else in their situation with the same amount of resources. Data could be very uniform with very few outliers or no outliers at all. And for example, it might fit a pattern of previous findings really, really cleanly. If there's a multi-site study, it might be much better at one site than at other sites. And in the publication record, you may run across this if you're a peer reviewer or if you're reviewing grants or if you're looking at people's CVs for a position. You might see copied passages or photos in publications. Altered photos is a big issue in publications. A change in the author or the order of authors might be a red flag. A journal name that is different from what you think it ought to be. An abstract that is listed as an article rather than just as an abstract, or an article that just doesn't exist maybe in the references. Okay, so let's broaden our picture just a little bit and think about bigger issues in social responsibility and research. A big one is resource poor contexts, because there are special ethical considerations really that we need to take into account in this context. And let's talk about it in the framework of the Belmont Report. Because the big difference between research in a resource-rich context and a resource-poor context is the situation of the human subjects and the participants and the collaborators that you might have in those contexts. So under the issue of respect for persons, the principle of respect for persons, it's important to think about informed consent as more than just a signature. Especially in contexts where populations have low literacy or language barriers, or maybe unfamiliarity with Western biomedicine or genetics or whatever science you're working on. Informed consent could be a much bigger issue than just signing a piece of paper. And also for populations for which signing a piece of paper maybe raises a lot of suspicions. It's also important to think about community consent, and this came up in the Havasupai case, for example. If you're doing research with a Native American group, if you're doing research in a village, and a lot of other places that have their own sort of internal governance system, you probably ought to be thinking about the way the community consents to research and getting the community on board. Who speaks for the community? Is there a leader, a recognized group of leaders, or not? How do you deal with that? So that's a question that is going to be different in every case. But even though individual consent is always required for research, community consent is a bigger issue that often comes into play, particularly with marginalized populations. The second principle, of course, is beneficence, and under that, we're thinking then about benefits and risks, not just in terms of the individual, but also in terms of the community. And also, when we think about risks in research and benefits in research, those are often compared to medical standards of care. Well, whose standards of care are we talking about? In low resource contexts, standards of care for a particular condition may be much lower than at, say, an academic medical center here in the US. So do we compare to their standard of care? Do we compare to our standard of care? That's an open question, and it's rather hotly debated, I will say, and it might be different from case to case. So that's something that you have to think about. And finally, you may not have heard this term ancillary care. Maybe you have. Ancillary care has to do with care that goes beyond what the actual research that you're doing is. So for example, if you're doing research on HIV in Africa, you may encounter people in remote populations that have low access to medical care who have all kinds of other things going on, malaria, or problems with childhood diseases, common childhood diseases, or all kinds of things that you might imagine, injuries, for example. So what are your duties as a researcher to provide ancillary care for individuals and for the community at large? And that would vary probably by case also. This is something that gets debated quite a lot. Finally, in the principle of justice, we have to think about who the research benefits. As I said, sometimes research gets done in marginalized communities that doesn't really benefit them so much, but it benefits high resource populations, maybe here in the US or elsewhere in the West. But even if the research could potentially benefit them for a specific condition that anyone could get, maybe it doesn't address issues that are really important to this community. Maybe this community is facing really big issues, medical or other issues, that are much more important to them, and putting resources into your research project just isn't the biggest priority that they should be facing right now. And finally, what happens after the research is over? You may have built infrastructure to support your research. What happens to that when you go? Will research participants have access to study interventions after the study ends? If the resulting intervention is costly, will the sponsor make it available at reduced cost to the community for some period of time? Those are all questions that researchers in research per context really ought to be thinking about ahead of time. Okay, so now let's go even bigger and just think about science as part of society and social responsibility in research. Not just human subjects research, but any kind of research that you might be doing. Now, why is social responsibility important? I think, it's easy to say in the very crass way that science is funded by the public, either directly or indirectly through NIH or some other entity. But as a bigger issue, research is really carried out in the name of society. It's an expression of society's needs and interests and priorities, and it should reflect those in some way. So if an issue is important to some segment of society, then it deserves to have research done on it. And if it's only important to one segment of society, how much emphasis should we be placing on it? Depends on what the needs and benefits of that are. And as I said before, from the Nuremberg Code on, we've recognized that any kinds of risks or burdens placed on research subjects, even if they're small, are only justifiable if research is valid and addresses an important need. So I think the biggest issue that is a little bit more subtle is that when you do research, when you're a scientist with special training, that gives you special knowledge, and that gives you both the ability and I would argue also a responsibility to impart that to society, not just to oppose misuse of your work and misinterpretation, but also to facilitate an informed citizenry. And that promotes democracy in a small d sense, in that in order to participate in the public sphere, citizens have to understand, and anyone who lives in our society has to understand the science that underlies issues that are important. So if you have special knowledge, it is, in a sense, your responsibility to help out with that. So what does that entail? Well, in the small sense, just in the scientific community, there's lots of ways that you can be a responsible citizen. You can contribute to interdisciplinary conversations. You should be doing peer reviews if you're being asked to do those. Obviously, it's a bit of a burden, so you don't want to do that at the expense of other things. But that's a big part of being a citizen of the scientific community. Peer reviews of manuscripts for journals, also of grants, all kinds of things like that. Committee service, that kind of thing. And then also mentoring. So you presumably have received some mentoring that got you where you are. And it is, I think, your responsibility to pass that on to the next generation of scientists that are coming along behind you. But in a more basic kind of way, it's important to honor your values. You got into science for a reason. It's probably very lofty and laudable. And when you come up on issues that have ethical implications, honor those values. Think about how those values play out in your science. So in any kind of research, even basic research, there's going to be downstream ethical implications. There's going to be potential uses or misuses of the knowledge you create. So you have to think about those ahead of time. Just having your nose in your microscope or in a particular protocol may blind you to some of those downstream implications. So sometimes interdisciplinary conversations can be a real benefit for that. Your mentors can also help you think about those things. And you also need to think carefully about how to communicate your science to the public. Talk with your mentors, talk with your peers, talk with your institution's PR office if you're creating op-eds or other things that get your science out to the public. They can help you do that, and they may need to help you do that. And of course, recognize and actively counter any kinds of hasty conclusions that might be drawn from your research. If you're doing research on health disparities, if you're doing research on inequities that map onto race or ethnicity or gender, there can be some kind of unfortunate conclusions that someone could draw from that if they don't fully understand what's going on. And you need to think about that ahead of time and be ready to counter those. Finally, just consider contributing to advocacy efforts related to your science. That might include policy briefs. It might include talking to your representatives or your policymakers at the local or the national level. Contribute white papers that will help people who make policy understand what's going on with your science. Okay, so with that, let's just talk briefly about this case study. And it was sent out ahead of time, so you may have some thoughts on that. And Aurelie, please speak up if you've gotten any chats about that. I haven't seen any, but I would love to hear it if there are. But I'm just going to summarize really quick that this is Dr. Salazar. She's in this remote village with a very small ethnic group. And it turns out that they may have some kind of natural immunity to leukemia. Now, she's developed a relationship with them because she's provided them with medical care. But now that she's coming back just to get samples for research, the Council of Elders is refusing to allow it. And her lab director has suggested that she do an end run around the council and approach families directly. So here's the questions. And I heard, Aurelie, was that your microphone coming on?
Yes.
So do you have any information from students that are thinking about this?
No, not yet. So we'll encourage the students to type their comments or the responses on the question section.
Okay, great. So we did get a little bit of response ahead of time on email, so I can look at those. So should Dr. Salazar approach individual families and explain her study to them in hopes of collecting blood samples? And as you think about that, you might think about what the benefits and the risks are for those individuals who choose to participate in the study. And also what might be the consequences for Dr. Salazar and other scientists conducting this kind of research. We had one response that that Dr. Salazar might just approach the council again and tell them that she thinks it ought to be up to individual families whether they participate or not. As far as benefits and risks, someone suggested that that people might be able to trade their participation in the form of blood samples for payment or goods that could help them in their everyday lives. And also a risk that someone mentioned, I'm looking here, that maybe more scientists, if this discovery is made, more scientists might come and actually bring additional diseases to them that they haven't been exposed to before. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Okay, I'm gonna move on to number 2, but please, if you have any comments on number 1, contribute them. So, does Dr. Salazar have implicit responsibilities to the village, to the elders, or to the families she's close to? So, I think we would all suggest that she probably does have some responsibilities to all 3 of those. How does her lab director's suggestion meet or not meet those responsibilities? So she's developed some trust, right? So you have to think about how anything she does from now on will enhance or violate that trust. So on the one hand, someone here says, I didn't like the idea of going behind the back of the council, but I did like the idea about paying individuals and providing them with resources. I think a question just came through, but I can't see it.
No,
Do you have it?
no, I was asking for our participants to submit their questions or comments.
Oh, okay, all right. And and I'll just talk briefly about the third question while people are thinking about whether they want to.
So I do have one if you want me to go over this one.
Oh, yeah, please do.
She has a responsibility to take care of the trust she has built with the people and Kawasinger community. The lab director's suggestions, although it's for the betterment of people globally, would ultimately cause harm to the community since those that participate would have gone against the elders' wishes and create an internal conflict in the community.
That's a good point. That's something that you have to think about when you think about the consent of a whole community. Any other comments on that? While you're thinking and possibly typing, I'm going to look at number 3 really quickly. So if she decides she doesn't want to take her lab director's suggestion, if she says, no, I'm not sure that that's the way to go, what else might she do? Well, who could she consult with? Who could she collaborate with? What could she do right away? And maybe what could she think about doing in the future? One person here by email said that she should consult with the council again and take the lab director's offer of money to them instead of to individual families. That's one way to go. Who could she collaborate with? This person says the council liaisons and the people. I'm not sure who the liaisons are, but she could collaborate with the council. Certainly, we know from past experience that in community-based research, it's always a good idea to create a collaborative relationship with the community, and in this case, that would probably be through the Council of Elders. And what steps could she take right away? Let's see. She could go to the council, of course. And she could also educate the council on the data and explain what a difference they've already made. So that's a good idea, appealing to their understanding of what good they could do in the world.
We have another.
Yeah.
Maybe she can offer other benefits to the community and the council that will come with the results of the study.
Okay. Sure. I think that we're seeing a little bit of a common theme here that doing an end run around the council could maybe cause internal divisions in the community and also divisions that would violate the relationship that she's built with them. And you know, certainly that's bad on its own merits, but also it means that that she might not be able to do future research there, and other people might not either who come in from the outside. So there's no hard and fast yes or no answers to these questions, but it's good to think with. It's good to think about in this fictional case some of the things that have happened in real life, in the Have a Soup By case that we talked about, and in lots of other cases that we know about in real life.
There's another comment that says, I also wish she can mentor members of the community so future research can come from the inside.
Oh, I love that. I love that comment. That's wonderful. So that has to do with collaboration, right? And dealing with the community as a partner in research rather than just as a subject of research. So that's a great way to approach the community, and that's something that maybe it would have been great if she had done from the very beginning, right? Instead of now that she's faced this roadblock. So you have the benefit of her mistakes to deal with. And to come at this in a new way when you do your own research. And this is not just in remote villages in South America. This is everywhere, especially if you're dealing with marginalized communities. Partnering with them rather than coming in sort of in a helicopter research kind of situation is much better.
This other comment says, this reminds me of the gun control research that was being developed by the CDC years ago and was stopped by the government.
Oh, okay. I hadn't thought about that. I'm not sure exactly what particular gun control research you're thinking about, but certainly there are a lot of communities that have a big interest in gun control research, and other communities that have an interest in seeing it stopped. So researchers who are interested in doing that research certainly would benefit from partnering with those communities. Okay, I'm so glad that you all stepped up and added some comments to this. And if you have any more thoughts later, please feel free to email them to me or Areli or someone else, and it would be great for future discussion of this.
We just have one more that came in. Yes, she should become a member of the community in order to gain trust, but also she should stress long-term goals after her research is done.
That's great, sure. And thinking long-term is hard to do when you're up against a publication deadline or a funding deadline, just as we talked about before. But if she's in this for the long haul, which you have to be in community-based research, that's great advice. Thanks, you guys. Those were wonderful contributions. I appreciate it. So,
thank you so much. This is a great. If you had a few more comments to mention.
The only thing I had in closing was just to let you know that your institution has lots of guidance for you. Wherever you are, you're going to have an Office of Research Integrity or Ethics and Compliance. You may have an ethics consultation service. You're probably going to have a clinical and translational science center, and you're going to have guidance committees and resources for various kinds of research. And so recognize that you're not just on your own. There are avenues to pursue if you have any concerns or questions about research integrity. So I really appreciate you listening today. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take any more questions that you may have.
Hi, yes, we just had one that came in. It says, can you give an example on how she can do ancillary care?
Sure. So ancillary care is something that comes up, as I said, in resource poor communities, resource poor contexts. So, for example, you may have a very narrow topic on in this case, Dr. Salazar is researching this particular genetic basis for leukemia. It doesn't have an immediate application, but it's very interesting to her. But she may have people come in that she's built relationships with come in to do this research, and in taking blood samples or in just looking over them generally, she may discover that they're dealing with some sort of chronic condition like diabetes, or some sort of condition that's endemic in that part of the world. And it may be that because she has a long-term relationship with this community, that she feels like she has an ethical responsibility to deal with those and to help people get medical care if it goes beyond what she herself can do. So that would be the responsibility of ancillary care. And if people who are just going into a community very briefly to take blood may not have a big responsibility of ancillary care, but someone who has a longer-term relationship, like Dr. Salazar has in this example, probably upon consideration would. And not only is that an ethical duty in the larger sense, but practically speaking, of course, that also builds trust. And it fulfills a responsibility to the community that helps them continue that relationship with you as a researcher. That's a great question. Thank you.
Our next question is, what are cost and time-effective ways of connecting communities to appropriate services after conducting research with them?
Oh, well, that would really depend on the context. Would depend on where you are. If you're in a low-resource community within the U.S., of course, it's going to be very different than if you're in a low-resource community in another country. But one of the best things to be doing, as someone mentioned so aptly, is partnering with researchers in that community or in that country if you're in another country, who then can continue those connections and help you navigate any kinds of concerns you may have or any kinds of mistakes that you might make. For example, asking questions that you shouldn't be asking, or providing advice that's really not good in that context. Someone who's already immersed in that community really can help you with that. So partnering ahead of time is a great is a great way to do that, because then you have that partnership after the research is over, or at least after that stage of the research is over and maybe you've gone back home. You feel like you've left people in good hands. And it's really context dependent, so I don't think I could give you some very specific advice on that, except that partnering with local agencies ahead of time and partnering with local researchers ahead of time will give you some great tools that that are usually pretty cost effective, because they're already dealing with these issues. Any other questions?
We do have another question that just wants to thank you for the presentation, and they're asking if they'll be able to receive a PDF of this PowerPoint. We will have our recording of the webinar uploaded on our website at exitotraining.org. And I do believe you did offer to send me a PDF.
I'm happy to do that. I know that there were some problems with the presentation, especially in the beginning, so I'll send a PDF and you can post it if you like, or
so
just send it to all the participants.
We'll upload it as well on the website so that anyone can go in there and view it. And then there's another comment that said, have you read the book Medical Apartheid? It also has great information in it related to these kind of ethical research issues.
Oh, no, I have not. So thank you so much for recommending that book. I will look for it. There's lots of great resources if you're interested in more resources on this. Obviously, a book that's made big headlines recently is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I didn't even talk about Henrietta Lacks in this presentation, but that's a really compelling book if you're interested in issues to do with marginalized populations and the benefits and risks of research. And there are lots and lots of others. But I will look into medical apartheid. Thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah, that's all the questions that we have.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you to our participants as well, and for your submissions of some great questions. And Dr. Nishi, thanks for this is a hard subject to cover in a webinar, but it's very important and critical to starting a research career. So again, thank you. We'll be having another webinar coming up in the fall, and we'll be sending out the dates for that one. So again, thank you so much. And we would like everybody to please complete their questionnaires and send them in as soon as you can. And Areli, anything else that you'd like to add?
No, you'll receive the survey after the webinar, so if you can just provide us with your feedback, we really appreciate it. The only way that we can improve and we can cover topics that you are interested is if we know what you are, what you're seeking. And then, like I mentioned, the webinar, the recording, along with the PDF of the PowerPoint will be uploaded on our website, and that's exitotraining.org. There's a webinars tab, and so all of our previous webinars are also included in that section.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again for all your support. Bye-bye.